The Galactic Empire was one of the strongest factions in the Star Wars universe ever, at least militarily. And yet, a relatively small group of rebel fighters managed to bring down the Empire. This was not least because the Empire had made some serious mistakes. So today we'll look at what those mistakes were, what advantages the rebels had against the Empire, and what the Empire could have done to avoid these mistakes. Without further ado, let's get straight to the Empire's mistakes. What should be relatively obvious is the fact that the Empire is the Empire. If it weren't the Empire, it wouldn't have had so many problems. That sounds a bit strange, but it's true. What I mean by that is that the Empire was a totalitarian, autocratic regime led by a Sith that oppressed many minorities. Of course, this turned many individuals against the Empire, which is what really got the Rebel Alliance going. The same applies to the Tarkin Doctrine, the idea of the Empire ruling through fear. More specifically, through the demonstration of military power and the fear this would inspire in the Empire's inhabitants. The ultimate embodiment of the Tarkin Doctrine were the two Death Stars, which also drove many millions of beings from the Empire to the rebels. The Death Stars thus achieved exactly the opposite of what they were intended to do. If the Empire had avoided all of this, it would have fared much better against the rebels, as the rebels would have received neither much support nor probably even been founded. But then the Empire wouldn't really be the Empire anymore, would it? More like another version of the Republic. But what would the Empire have to change roughly as it was to better deal with the rebels? To clarify this, let's first look at what the rebels' advantages actually were in order to understand what the Empire could have done about it. The rebels initially had the advantage of being small, widely scattered rebel cells. Of course, this brought many disadvantages for the rebels, but this mentality of being virtually everywhere in the galaxy led to a stateless strategy. This meant that the rebels didn't have a large capital planet that the Empire could simply conquer and bring down the whole alliance. While the Empire on the other hand had important planets like Coruscant, Kuat, Fondor, Carida or others, which the Empire wanted to hold at all costs. The rebels on the other hand could simply flee their current capital planet in the event of an attack. They weren't tied to any location and could therefore set up camp virtually anywhere and attack from anywhere. This not only made it more difficult to completely defeat the rebels, this made it incredibly difficult for the Empire to predict where the rebels would strike next. This was further exacerbated by the fact that, especially in the early stages, the rebels relied on small, fast ships and attacks. The rebel starfighters in particular posed a major problem for the Empire. Sometimes the rebels attacked with only a handful of starfighter squadrons, but they managed to blow up military complexes, convoys, fuel depots or shipyards and escape before the Empire could really do anything. And even if the Empire was fast enough, it was actually unprepared to fight such small, fast and well-equipped fighters. This allowed the rebels to operate small fighter squadrons with just a few pilots and mechanics, which could inflict immense damage on the Empire. The fighter squadrons would jump into an Imperial system, select one or two relatively simple but important targets, bombard them with their powerful weapons, torpedoes, missiles, and usually flee before the local garrison could even launch their TIE fighters. This allowed the rebels to inflict significant damage with little effort and extremely few casualties. A single one of these battles didn't win the war for the rebels, but over time the losses added up, and the Empire lost a great deal of ships, troops, fuel, ammunition and money. But it didn't have to be this way. The Empire could have countered this effectively. First of all, better fighters of their own would have been a must. The Empire's TIEs, while fast and maneuverable, were neither well armed nor equipped with shields, life support or hyperdrives. This was problematic in many ways. The speed and maneuverability of the TIEs allowed experienced elite pilots to easily outmaneuver the rebel fighters left and right and take them out one by one. There it didn't really matter whether the fighters had shields or life support. But by no means were all TIE pilots elite pilots. Most of them didn't even survive their first mission. And that's bad when the enemy primarily uses fighters themselves. Because in such rapid hit and run attacks, it's the Empire's fighters that can intervene first. The capital ships would probably take longer to be able to help. That's why it probably would have been advantageous for the Empire to rely more on better fighters. Both in Legends and in canon there were prototype lines for better fighters, but nothing that was mass-produced quickly enough. In canon we know from the novel Thrawn Treason that Grand Moff Tarkin played Thrawn against Krennic, and these two, Thrawn and Krennic, fought in a power struggle over resources. The choice here was between allocating resources to the Death Star project or Thrawn's TIE Defender project. But if more resources had been invested in better fighters like the TIE Defenders or others like it from the start instead of the Death Star, the Empire would have fared much better against the rebels. The great thing about the Defenders was that they had shields, were still very fast and maneuverable, and were also equipped with a multitude of sometimes powerful weapons. This means that the Defenders were good against fighters, but could also be very dangerous to capital ships and were therefore perfect against the rebels. The other advantage the Defenders had, which the Empire desperately needed, would have been the Defenders' hyperdrive. The rebels usually attacked with their fighters and disappeared back into hyperspace with them within an hour at the latest. Since normal TIEs didn't have hyperdrives, they couldn't pursue the rebel fighters. Instead, they had to be picked up by a mothership, which took time. Even worse, sometimes the rebels simply attacked planets that only had a few space stations or ground bases equipped with TIE fighters, but those planets didn't have any larger ships that could accommodate those TIEs. After such an attack, it was often impossible for the Empire to properly pursue the rebels. The TIE Defenders would have made that at least somewhat possible. But that's not all the Empire could have done to better position itself against the rebels. And I just realized that we've only just finished the TIE Defenders, and I've been chatting for quite a while. This video is probably longer than I thought. If you like the content here, please give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see more, subscribe. Making these long videos is a lot of work, and you'd help me a lot by doing it. The Empire's next problem also has to do with the Tarkin Doctrine. In addition to super weapons, the philosophy for other capital ships was always bigger, stronger and more intimidating. So huge Star Destroyers and super Star Destroyers were built, which were primarily equipped with ion cannons and turbolasers, weapons to bomb continents or destroy other ships of their size. Not to destroy small, fast fighters. The Imperial 1 class Star Destroyer at least had anti-fighter weapons, but the Imperial 2 class Star Destroyers no longer had them. And since the focus was on these massive warships, smaller ships focused on fighting fighters were increasingly neglected. And this despite the fact that the Rebel Alliance, especially in the early days, hardly had any truly powerful capital ships. One ship that could have helped the Empire immensely would have been the Lancer-class frigate. These 250-meter-long ships were designed purely for fighting starfighters. For capital ships, they were relatively fast and were armed with a total of 20 quadruple-point defense turrets. In other words, they had exactly the kind of weaponry that could take down starfighters. The difficult thing about the frigates was that they had a range that was significantly greater than that of most starfighter weapons. Used correctly, these frigates could destroy entire starfighter squadrons without endangering themselves. If placed at hyperspace jump points, they could also prevent other fighters from escaping. But these frigates were too tiny compared to the large, powerful Star Destroyers, and their armament wasn't intimidating enough, so they were only produced in small numbers. Such frigates struck fear into even the most experienced rebel pilot, something we also experienced several times in Legends and the X-Wing novels. Yet the Empire focused more on producing massive warships, for which, however, there were no real opponents on the other side for most of the time. So to sum it up, the Empire could have built fewer massive capital ships and instead focused more on smaller, more effective capital ships against fighters, and of course could have better equipped its larger ships for fighter defense. Another point, the rebel starfighters were powerful, yes, but their great advantage was that they could attack quickly and then escape. If the Empire had the ability to prevent the rebels from escaping, that would have been a huge advantage. Not only to thwart such hit-and-run attacks, but also to potentially detain the rebel leadership and prevent them from escaping. The thing is, the Empire already had exactly such a technology, or at least developed it over time. Interdictor technology. In Legends, this technology existed thousands of years before the Empire. In canon, I'm not really sure if we know when this was invented. However, I believe that the Empire first developed this technology in canon. This could be installed on ships and when activated ensured that ships near this new ship couldn't jump into hyperspace. An incredibly useful Imperial technology that was used far too little. In canon, it may well be that the technology was simply too new to be used on a large scale. In Legends, however, the Empire actually has no excuse not to position an Interdictor on every other corner to potentially detain rebels. The Empire actually has no excuse not to position an Interdictor on every other corner to potentially detain rebels. Deployed together with Lancer frigates and TIE defenders, this could have had a huge impact. Now we've talked a lot about fighters and starships, but there's another factor that shouldn't be overlooked, and that's influence. The Empire was an autocracy, where influence and connections were often more important than one's own abilities. This was also the case in the Imperial military and fleet. It was not uncommon for people with a lot of influence, people close to Palpatine, to be elevated to high military positions. A good example of this is Ishin Il-Raz, one of the 12 Grand Admirals of the Empire. Ishin Il-Raz became well known in the Republic at a young age in Compor, an organization that tried to hold the Republic together during the war. When the Empire emerged, Compor became Comp Nor, and that became a huge beast, an organization that wanted to ensure that Imperial citizens were truly loyal. Through propaganda, through large-scale wiretapping, through censorship of art, but also through specially run secret service, the ISB. Ishin Il-Raz became the head of this organization and helped to promote a humanocentric worldview, and thus fueled xenophobia, the hatred of aliens. Over time, Raz began to completely elevate Palpatine to a pedestal, what everyone does when they're a fan of someone. He committed several horrific mass murders to win Palpatine's favor. We don't know exactly what was behind these though. The thing is, it more or less worked. Il-Raz was appointed one of the 12 Grand Admirals, one of the absolute highest positions in the Imperial Navy. Not because his military skills were so good, but simply because he was absolutely loyal to Palpatine. Perhaps this assured Palpatine that this Grand Admiral wouldn't turn against him. This secured Palpatine's power to some extent. At the same time, Il-Raz was just the tip of the iceberg. For every truly competent commander in the Empire, there were also a few officers who held their positions simply out of loyalty or influence, no matter how competent they were. And that could certainly bring victory to the rebels in one battle or another. Of course, with a ruler like Palpatine who constantly had to fear coup attempts, it is difficult to appoint people to high positions. Nevertheless, I think it would have been beneficial for the Empire to have focused not only on loyalty, but also on competence when awarding high positions. To summarize, I think the Empire would have been wise to use fewer superweapons and large ships, to focus more on anti-fighter weapons and ships, and to employ better fighters, to use more interdictor ships and to appoint more competent officers to high positions. But what do you say? Am I right or not? And can you think of anything else the Empire could have done better? Post it in the comments below. If you liked the video, as I said, I would really appreciate a thumbs up, it really helps a lot. And if you want to learn more about the Imperial Star Destroyers, watch the linked 50 facts video in the end card. Have a great day and may the Force be with you!